Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the shadowy halls of Tudor England, where even the heavy scent of incense can't cover the stench of death lurking in the air. Picture this: towering stone walls, candlelight flickering across embroidered tapestries, and behind all that royal splendor sits a king slowly being betrayed by his own body. This is no longer the handsome golden prince you see in portraits. This is Henry VIII, born on June 28, 1491. In his final days, he was bloated, furious, and rotting from within. Trust me, by the time you hear the whole story, you might think you can't handle it, but don't worry, you'll make it through. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I create here. And while you're watching, leave me a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now where you live. I absolutely love seeing how our night owl community stretches across the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's drift together into tonight's journey. Picture this: an early morning in 16th century England. Faint sunlight slips through the mist over the River Thames, and from the palace gates appears a figure who would make all of Europe bow its head. That figure is Henry Tudor, the young prince whose name history would carve into 3 letters: Henry VIII. When he becomes the King of England, exercising his canonical throne over the empire, he sees the ring. This is not the obese king with the red face and bandaged legs you've heard about from his final years. No, right now, Henry is still the golden prince of the Renaissance. Tall, broad-shouldered, with blazing red hair and striking blue eyes. A physique any royal court would envy. And if social media had existed back then, Henry's account would have exploded with hearts and messages. He wasn't only a fierce warrior, charging on horseback and swinging his sword on the tilt yard. Henry was also an artist. He played music, wrote poetry, danced until sunrise, and debated theology with the confidence of a university scholar. A king, fluent in many languages, skilled in sport, magnetic in charm, all contained within one man. To the English people, he was the dream image of a ruler. To Europe, he was an unpredictable threat. Spain rushed to secure an alliance through marriage with Princess Catherine of Aragon. France kept a close watch on his every move, and the Pope granted Henry the grand title of Defender of the Faith, seeing him as a shield against the storm of the Reformation. At that time, Hampton Court Palace was nothing short of a paradise of revelry. Glittering dances, lavish banquets, noisy hunts deep in the woods, all painted a picture of a reign bursting with energy and promise. People believed that under Henry's guidance, England was stepping into a golden age. But history has a cruel habit. It builds up a dazzling symbol, only to cast that figure into the deepest shadows, and Henry VIII was the perfect example. Behind the radiant facade, Henry carried a dangerous passion: jousting, the brutal sport of tilting with lances on horseback, a noble entertainment for kings, but a nightmare for the human body. Imagine 2 war horses thundering forward, 2 knights in heavy armor colliding with the force of a modern car crash, the clash of steel on steel, the shriek of horses, the crowd holding its breath. It was a moment of unbearable tension. Henry loved the sport the way modern Americans love football, except instead of sitting in the stands with snacks, he put his own body at the center of the collision. And it was this obsession which, on one January afternoon in the year 1536, would become the turning point, after which Henry would never truly be the same man again. But that is a story for the next chapter. For now, remember this: Henry VIII was once the blazing golden prince, a figure admired and feared across Europe. And it is this violent contrast between the brilliance of his beginning and the darkness of his decline that makes his tragedy so haunting. On that fateful day, January 24th, 1536, at Greenwich Palace, the vast tilt yard stretched under the cold winter sun. In the stands, nobles, courtiers, and commoners held their breath. Before them was the King of England, Henry VIII, 44 years old, still towering, still radiating raw power. He rode atop a massive warhorse, his body wrapped in gleaming armor, each piece of steel worth more than a laborer's yearly wage. The sight alone was overwhelming. Drums thundered, trumpets blared. Henry spurred his horse forward, lance lowered, eyes locked on his opponent. The pounding of hooves echoed like thunder. The crowd fell silent, every gaze fixed on two war horses charging like arrows loosed from the bow. And then, the moment of destiny. A brutal crash. Steel against steel, bodies against bodies. The horses didn't just collide, they slammed together with a force no different from a modern car accident at high speed. Henry was thrown violently from the saddle, his body, over 280 pounds clad in iron, struck the frozen ground with devastating weight. Worse still, the massive horse lost its footing and collapsed, crashing down upon the armored king. The tilt yard froze in horror. Gasps, screams. Some believed England had lost its king right there in what was meant to be a royal game. Henry lay motionless. For 2 long hours he did not wake. 2 hours, a span that made the whole kingdom hold its breath. Who would inherit the throne if he died? Would civil war erupt? England's future flickered like a candle in the wind. Inside the palace, Queen Anne Boleyn, pregnant at the time, was overcome with dread. The child in her womb was the kingdom's hope for a male heir, and in one winter afternoon that hope seemed ready to collapse. When Henry finally opened his eyes, witnesses said his gaze was no longer the same. The once bright blue now carried a strange, unsettling shadow. His first words were not gratitude for survival, not concern for his people. Instead, he raged, shouting, demanding to know why the joust had been stopped. From that moment, whispers spread. The Golden Prince was gone. In his place stood a man transformed, angry, suspicious, unstable. Modern science suggests Henry had suffered a severe traumatic brain injury. The violent blow damaged his frontal lobe, the part of the brain that governs emotion and self-control. From then on, his temperament was never the same. Before 1536, Henry was considered a comparatively kind monarch by the standards of his age. He had endured over 20 years of marriage with Catherine of Aragon, and executions under his reign had been fewer than those of previous kings. But after the accident, the storm of blood began, just 4 months later. Anne Boleyn, the wife for whom Henry had broken with Rome, was beheaded. Even his trusted right hand, Thomas Cromwell, would eventually fall to the earth. Inside the palace, courtiers whispered of terrifying outbursts. One moment Henry laughed, the next he wept, and in the very same breath he screamed for blood. Servants moved like cats, terrified that a single sound might cost them their lives. But the accident did not only shatter Henry's mind, it reopened an old leg wound from an earlier joust. What once had seemed healed became a massive ulcer, festering, oozing, tormenting him for the rest of his life. Imagine living with sores the size of tennis balls on both legs. Not for days, not for weeks, but for more than a decade. Constant pus, stench, pain so intense that the brush of a bed sheet could make him howl. The secret notes of his physician, Thomas Vickers, later discovered, described them plainly. Ulcers hideous, stinking, and insufferably painful. Every day, Henry's legs had to be lanced, draining bowls of pus that servants carried away in silence, holding their breath. In his arrogance, Henry tried to hide the truth. He ordered metal braces forged to press the wounds closed, hoping they might heal. Instead, the pressure trapped blood, worsened infection. He poured whole flasks of Arabian perfume over his body to mask the smell of decay. He commanded painters to depict him standing tall, legs strong, in poses of defiance and power. But reality could not be disguised. The ulcers poisoned his blood, seeping into his liver, his heart, his brain. Chronic bone infection turned his body into a living furnace of disease. Day after day, the pain drilled into his bones. Sometimes he shook with fever, sometimes he gorged himself in desperate escape, growing ever heavier. The toll on his mind grew darker. One moment he laughed. The next he condemned to death the very man who had just poured his wine. Paranoia consumed him. He believed servants were poisoning his bandages. He believed wives betrayed him. He believed assassins lurked in every shadow. And that was only the beginning of the nightmare. By 1542, the ulcers had worsened further, pus turning green, then brown, with such a stench that records called it the smell of death. Henry, once hailed as the most handsome prince in Europe, now swelled to such monstrous size that doors, floors, even thrones had to be reinforced to hold his body. Remember the beginning? That afternoon in 1536, when Henry fell beneath the hooves, lying unconscious for 2 long hours. When he awoke, he was no longer the man he had been. That accident opened the gates of a long descent, body and soul, dragging the king from golden glory into a living nightmare. And in the next chapter, we will see his transformation spiral even further, from physical agony into a maze of visions, hauntings, and an obsession with death itself. Imagine living in the English court after 1536. The great doors of Hampton Court still opened and closed each day. The trumpets still sounded every morning, and feasts still unfolded under candlelight. But there was one thing everyone could see. The king was no longer the same. Henry VIII, the Golden Prince once admired across Europe, had become another man, unpredictable, short-tempered, and so terrifying that a single frown from him could silence an entire hall. Courtiers whispered of dreadful audiences. That morning the king might laugh, tell jokes, and shower gold on a musician. Yet just hours later, enraged by some careless remark, he would roar for the very same man's head. No one could be certain they would survive a single day in the palace. From the accident onward, Henry's rages became his signature. He could weep like a child one moment, then order the execution of a nobleman for nothing more than staring too long. For the servants walking past the king's chamber was like crossing a minefield. One wrong step, and it was the end. And so the blood began to flow. Anne Boleyn, the wife Henry had risked everything to marry, was no longer spared. Just 4 months after the accident, she climbed the scaffold, the most famous victim of his fury. Thomas Cromwell, his right hand, his trusted advisor, the man who had guided Henry through countless crises, soon followed her into the grave. The atmosphere in the palace was as heavy as steel armor. Everyone understood. Henry was no longer the compassionate monarch of his early reign. He had become a true tyrant. But the horror didn't end there. The accident of 1536 left not only psychological scars, but also a physical nightmare. The ulcers on his legs worsened. Pus seeped daily. The smell of death filled his chambers. Servants carried away bowls of foul discharge in silence, holding their breath. Henry tried to hide the rot with grotesque methods. He ordered iron braces to press the wounds shut, poured costly perfumes imported from Arabia over his body, and commanded painters to show him with strong legs standing proud. On canvas, he was still the invincible hero. In reality, he was a patient tormented by every passing hour. Physical pain only fueled the madness of his mind. Modern historians believe the poisoned blood from his wounds seeped into his nervous system, causing hallucinations and emotional collapse. One day he might roar with laughter at a jester, only to coldly order his hanging moments later. Some claimed Henry once pointed to an empty chair, shouting that Anne Boleyn was sitting there, mocking him. By now the palace had become a theater of fear. Courtiers devised secret signals to track the king's moods. Red ribbons meant anger, black meant despair, and white, rare and precious, meant a fleeting peace. Every word, every step, had to be measured as if walking on thin ice. Henry's paranoia deepened. He believed the bandages on his legs were laced with poison, demanding to sniff them before burning them. He forced courtiers to test ointments on their own skin, convinced assassins lurked behind every corner. Meanwhile, his body swelled to monstrous size. From 280 pounds, he ballooned to over 350. His old armor was discarded, replaced with a new suit boasting a waist of 54 inches, wider than a modern refrigerator. The palace floors were reinforced with beams, doors widened, chairs specially built to bear his weight. It was said Henry had to be dressed on his bed, 4 attendants lifting each heavy limb. A pulley system was rigged to hoist him upright, then lowered him onto a wheeled chair, hidden as much as possible to preserve appearances. The warrior king had become a giant invalid, imprisoned in his own body. But the most terrifying prison was his mind. Henry grew ever more obsessed with death. In his final portrait, the famous Whitehall image, the painter originally showed him holding a staff topped with a human skull. That detail was later erased on his son's orders, but those who saw it understood. Henry spent his last years haunted, tapping skulls against the floor as he spoke, as though reminding others, and himself, that death was always at hand. The Tudor court, once the beating heart of European power, had become a darkened house where expensive perfumes mingled with the stench of rotting flesh. Nobles held pomanders to their noses during audiences. Some court ladies vomited in the halls after meeting the king. Henry VIII had once been the Golden Prince, the symbol of an age. Now he was a diseased giant, pitiful and terrifying all at once. And this tragedy was only the prelude. For in his final years, Henry did not simply rot from within. He slipped deeper into a maze of visions, haunted by ghosts of the past, where absolute power dissolved into absolute loneliness. And in the next part, you will witness his complete collapse. Henry VIII, the man who once defied the Pope himself, screaming in the dark, speaking to the dead, and preparing for an end that chilled all of Europe. Step into Whitehall Palace in the final years of Henry VIII. From a distance, you could already smell it, a sickly mix of costly perfume and rotting flesh. It wasn't the scent of a banquet, it was the stench rising from the king himself. Henry sat upon his throne, his enormous body propped up by cushions, his breathing heavy, his face swollen. But it wasn't his figure that unsettled people most. It was his eyes. Once praised as bright as a summer sky, his blue eyes were now yellowed, weary, and often drifted into empty space. Courtiers told how he would suddenly freeze mid-council, his face pale, staring into nothing. After moments of silence, he whispered, "Not yet," or "Go away," as if dismissing a ghost no one else could see. The officials around him shuddered, afraid to even breathe. The past dragged Henry into a private hell. He spoke to his father, Henry VII, about wasted money. He called out to his mother, Elizabeth of York, begging for protection. Most chilling of all, he saw the dead: Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Cromwell. In his rotting mind, they returned to mock him and demand blood. A French ambassador once reported that at a royal supper, Henry suddenly rose, helped by servants, then screamed at an empty chair, "You dare sit at my table, witch?" He shouted that Anne Boleyn had returned, swearing to behead her again. Then he sat down and calmly resumed eating as if nothing had happened. The hall stayed silent, no one daring to meet another's eyes. It wasn't only ghosts. Henry distrusted the living as well. He believed the bandages on his legs were poisoned. Each time they were changed, he made servants let him sniff them, then burn them on the spot. He forced courtiers to smear ointments on their own skin before they touched his wounds. To him, every shadow in the palace hid a traitor. Paranoia consumed the entire court. Officials devised a warning system for the king's moods. Ribbons hung in the halls. Red for rage, black for despair, white, rare and precious, meant a rare moment of calm. In his final portrait, Henry was painted standing proud, leaning on a staff. But when the canvas was scanned with X-ray in the 20th century, a gruesome secret appeared. At first, the painter had shown him holding a staff topped with a human skull. His son, Edward VI, had ordered it erased. But the truth was clear. Henry spent his last years obsessed, tapping a skull against the floor as he spoke, a constant reminder that death was waiting. The attempts to hide the decay grew absurd. Perfume, incense, herbs burned in every corner. Noble women carried pomanders to mask the smell when meeting the king. Some left the chamber only to vomit in the halls. But nothing could disguise the reek of his rotting legs, swollen and oozing green and yellow pus. By the year 1546, Henry was barely human. He sat immobile on the throne, his massive body swollen, his face distorted, his eyes bloodshot. His breath reeked of death. For audiences, 4 men had to lift and drop him into a chair like a fallen stone. The king who once rode war horses like a god was now a living statue, and the stench of decay was his truest herald. Most terrifying of all were the ghostly recollections. Henry didn't just see the dead. He spoke with them, argued, wept, begged. Some courtiers believed it was his nerves rotting from blood poisoning. But for those who lived in the palace, it was proof the king was haunted. At times he even called out the names of children who had never lived, stillborn heirs, infants lost in infancy. He begged their forgiveness, promising to be a better father if only they returned. At night his cries echoed through the halls, chilling the guards to the bone. Death was no longer distant. It was present in every groan, every drop of pus, every fevered dream. Henry knew he was rotting from within. But instead of surrendering, he clung to power like a drowning man to driftwood. He still signed death warrants, still mistrusted every glance, still forced himself to believe the throne was his. Meanwhile, Europe watched. Ambassadors from France and Spain reported home. A king, bloated, foul-smelling, half-mad, yet still terrifying because power had not left him. They called him the rotting god, at once grotesque and unforgettable. Henry VIII had once been the Golden Prince. Now he was nothing more than a bloated shadow, haunted by the souls he had sent to the scaffold. And as the year 1547 drew near, everyone knew the end was only a matter of time. In the next part, you will witness his final days, when his body collapsed organ by organ, and death came for Henry in one of the most horrific endings history has ever recorded. Imagine January of 1547, Whitehall Palace frozen in winter. Windows stood wide open despite the bitter cold, because if they were shut, the king's chamber would become a morgue. The air was thick with the stench of death, a suffocating mix of burning herbs, incense, and the foul odor seeping from Henry VIII's swollen, ulcerated legs. By now, Henry was no longer the mighty king who once rode to war. He was a massive lump of flesh, skin yellow from a failing liver, eyes bloodshot, breath reeking of decay. The words that once made Europe tremble were now broken groans, his tongue so swollen he could barely form a sentence. Doctors wrote that his legs had split open, bone jutting out like rotting branches. They oozed pus constantly, soaking through dozens of bandages each day. 6 attendants had to rotate his enormous body to prevent bed sores, but it was useless. His whole form was a portrait of rot. By January 20th, modern physicians believe he had entered total organ failure. His kidneys barely functioned. His belly swelled with fluid. His breathing rattled. His urine turned thick and black. Henry knew he was dying. In rare moments of clarity, he begged his doctors to save him, promising endless gold. But when they shook their heads, he roared for their execution. At night, he raved in delirium. He called for his mother, begging for protection. He wept for his brother Arthur, the prince who had died young and left him the throne. Worst of all, he cried out for Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, abandoned and humiliated, pleading for forgiveness. His cries echoed through the halls, making the guards shrink back in fear. On January 27th, Henry suffered a massive stroke. Half his face drooped, saliva soaked his pillow, and his words dissolved into gibberish. The king, who once thundered against the Pope, could not even say the word water, yet he still clutched a pen, forcing himself to sign the death warrant of the Duke of Norfolk. The signature was nothing more than a trembling blot of ink, but the fear of Henry's name was enough to ready the scaffold. Only Henry's death the next day spared Norfolk from the axe. On his final night, Archbishop Cranmer was summoned. He later wrote that the scene in the king's chamber was unforgettable. 6 men held Henry down as violent convulsions ripped his body apart. The wooden bed cracked. His groans mingled with wet choking sounds as he vomited black fluid from his rotting stomach. The stench was so overwhelming, Cranmer himself ran outside to vomit before returning. When he returned, between spasms, Henry opened his eyes, staring into emptiness, crying for the children who had never lived. He promised to be a better father if they came back. Then his voice turned to shrieks. He screamed of fire bursting beneath him, of demons crawling under his bed to drag him to hell. Around 2 in the morning on January 28th, his breathing turned to the wet rattle that medicine today calls the death rattle. Cranmer took his hand and told him, "If you still believe in Christ, squeeze once." Henry managed a single squeeze. Then his massive hand fell limp. The king died at 2:07 a.m. But death was not the end. It only made the nightmare worse. His corpse swelled grotesquely, gases building until even the thick lead coffin could not contain it. Within hours, muffled explosions echoed from the casket like a boiling cauldron. The stench spread through the halls, making guards retch and flee. The court panicked. They hid the king's death for 3 days, both to prepare the succession and to find a way to handle the monstrous corpse. When embalmers opened him, they recoiled in horror. His liver was bloated, intestines black, heart swollen, all so decayed they crumbled at the touch. They stuffed in hundreds of pounds of salt and herbs, wrapped him in wax and pitch, all to preserve the dignity of a king once called God's anointed. But even that could not stop disaster. When the funeral procession paused overnight at St. Cannon's Abbey, the coffin burst with a thunderous crack. Putrid fluid poured across the chapel floor. The next morning, guards discovered a scene that haunted them forever. Stray dogs had crept inside and licked the liquid dripping from the king's body. Henry VIII, the man who defied the Pope, who shook Europe with his will, was reduced to food for dogs. Official records claimed he died peacefully and was buried with honor. But the truth, revealed in private diaries and diplomatic reports, was far darker. From the brightest golden prince in Europe, Henry ended as a bloated corpse that exploded, forgotten by those who once trembled before him. And that is history's cruelest irony. Absolute power cannot save a man from the rot of his body or the torment of his soul. On the morning of January 28, 1547, just past the 3rd hour, England officially lost the king who had once terrified all of Europe. But inside Whitehall Palace, there were no tolling bells, no solemn announcement. Instead, there was a tense, suffocating silence. Courtiers trembled, knowing they faced not only the king's death, but also a dreadful challenge: how to conceal the truth of his rotting corpse. The death of Henry VIII was nothing like what official records would later claim. He did not pass away peacefully in his sleep. He died convulsing, screaming, vomiting black fluid, his body swelling until the bed cracked beneath him. Even after his final breath, his corpse decayed so quickly that anyone who stepped into the chamber had to cover mouth and nose against the stench. And so the Privy Council made a bold decision to hide his death for 3 days. Publicly, they said the king was resting, recovering from illness. Behind closed doors, embalmers worked frantically day and night. What they faced was beyond imagination. When they opened Henry's body, his liver disintegrated at a touch, his heart grotesquely swollen, his intestines black as tar. The stench was so overwhelming that one embalmer fainted on the spot. They stuffed the corpse with hundreds of pounds of salt, packed it with fragrant herbs, coated it with wax, drenched it in pitch. But the body swelled like a drum, gases building until even the thick lead coffin began to crack. At the lying-in state in Whitehall, witnesses recalled strange popping noises from inside the coffin, like a pressure cooker ready to burst. Servants panicked, covering the bulges with black cloth. No one dared speak of it, but all knew the king's body was rebelling even in death. When the coffin was carried to Windsor, it took a special cart drawn by 8 horses to move the half-ton weight. Winter rains turned the roads to mud, and the 3-day journey dragged on. On the second night, they stopped at St. Cannon's Abbey, a monastery Henry himself had dissolved years before. And it was there the final humiliation struck. The coffin burst in the night, spilling putrid liquid across the chapel floor. By morning, guards discovered a sight that haunted them forever. Stray dogs had broken in and licked the fluids seeping from the king's body. A monarch who had called himself God's anointed, who had defied the Pope and bent nations to his will, ended as carrion for dogs. No ending could be more degrading. Edward Seymour, now Duke of Somerset and regent for the boy King Edward VI, knew that if the truth spread, the crown's authority would collapse. He issued an absolute decree. Every witness was to remain silent, under penalty of death. Official records declared only King Henry VIII passed peacefully and was buried with all honor. The truth was buried under lead and lies. But time, as always, had its way. Private diaries, foreign ambassadors' reports, and physicians' hidden notes slowly surfaced. Piece by gruesome piece, the real story emerged. Henry VIII did not die in glory, but in stench, terror, and the silent contempt of those who once bowed to him. So what legacy did he leave? Politically, Henry VIII broke England's tie with Rome, creating an independent Church of England. He launched a new era, severed forever from Catholic Europe. That legacy shaped English religion and politics for centuries. In family, he left only tragedy. 6 wives, 2 executed, 1 discarded to die in loneliness, 1 dead in childbirth. He longed for a son, but in the end it was his daughter, Elizabeth I, who ruled England as one of the greatest monarchs in history. A bitter irony. The daughter he once dismissed became his enduring legacy. In image, Henry VIII became a warning about absolute power. In youth, the Golden Prince, handsome, strong, gifted, but limitless authority mixed with ambition and disease turned him into a tyrant, dying in disgrace. Perhaps that is history's cruelest irony. A man who ruled a nation could not rule his own body. And the truth of his grotesque death, his body bursting, dogs lapping at his remains, is the rawest symbol of the fragility of human power. Today, when people recall Henry VIII, they remember the 6 wives, the break with Rome, the imposing portraits. But look deeper, and you'll find a darker tale. The story of a king who rotted from within, who died in fear, and whom history itself transformed into a lesson for all time. After Henry VIII's massive body was sealed inside a lead coffin and taken to Windsor, the court believed everything had finally been put to rest. But, in truth, his death only opened the door to a series of strange tales, ghosts clinging to the Tudor dynasty like fog drifting over the River Thames. Among the people, whispers spread that Henry's soul never found peace. Some servants claimed that while the coffin still lay at Whitehall, they heard steady knocking from inside the lead box. Others swore they saw the lid tremble, as if a giant hand within was trying to break free. The rational explanation was the buildup of gases from decomposition, yet to those who witnessed it, it was proof that the Tudor monster had not yet released his grip on the world. As the funeral procession passed through small villages, crowds gathered along the road. There was mourning in the air, but instead of weeping, people murmured among themselves. Some said he died this way as punishment for the churches he destroyed. Others sighed. Whatever else, he was the king who freed England from Rome. In truth, the people's feelings toward Henry were more complicated than for any monarch before him. Hatred, fear, and respect intertwined. The monks he had cast out into the streets believed his rotting death was God's punishment. They whispered a prophecy. He who sows blood shall reap decay. And so the legend spread, that Henry's spirit wandered forever through the abandoned monasteries, where prayers once rang but now only the wind howled through shattered windows. Another strange detail, the funeral of Henry VIII, though recorded as solemn and grand, lacked one element found in nearly all royal funerals: genuine grief. Courtiers stayed silent out of fear. The people were more curious than sorrowful, and Europe exhaled in relief. France and Spain saw a chance to bargain with his successor, Edward VI, while in Rome, the Pope was said to murmur quietly, "The wolf has fallen." Later, those who had been present on the night the coffin burst at St. Cannon's Abbey confessed they could never forget the sight of dogs licking the fluids that leaked from the king's body. Though Seymour had ordered silence under threat of death, the story spread like smoldering fire. It became one of Europe's darkest anecdotes, a king who called himself God's anointed, ending like the carcass of an animal. This is why, centuries later, when stories of Henry VIII are told, his death is remembered as vividly as his 6 marriages or his break with Rome. In collective memory, no downfall was greater than the truth that a man who once wielded absolute power could not even command his own corpse. This part is not the ending, but a bridge to another realm, no longer seeing Henry as flesh and blood, but as a symbol. A figure who stepped out of history into legend, a legend glorious and rotten, haunting enough that for years after, few dared to even speak his name aloud. When Henry VIII drew his final breath in that chamber thick with the stench of decay, those present did not weep, nor did they kneel in prayer. They simply looked at one another, silent. The silence was so heavy it felt as though all of Whitehall Palace itself had stopped breathing. No one dared to be the first to speak, for even with the king's body cold, the fear of him still lived on. The lords of the realm knew a single wrong word, a tear in the wrong place, even a sigh of relief could mark them as targets in the power games to come. For 3 days of hidden mourning, the court felt like a steel cage locked shut. Every word weighed like lead. The servants, long accustomed to tiptoeing around Henry, kept doing so now, as if the king might rise at any moment and order an execution. Behind the curtain, the Privy Council met in secret. Edward Seymour, uncle to young Prince Edward, quickly seized control. They understood. Henry's death had to be edited. The people would not hear of bursting coffins or dogs lapping at his corpse. They would hear instead of a king who passed peacefully, leaving the throne with dignity. While the court tried to bury the truth, foreign ambassadors rushed to report it. The French envoy wrote of a king deformed, heavy as stone, who finally collapsed in fear. The Spanish ambassador whispered home, "Rome's greatest enemy has died in humiliation." Across Europe, word spread. Henry VIII had fallen. The irony was bitter. In life, Henry made men tremble. In death, he made them sigh in relief. Courts across Europe exhaled. In Rome, the Pope is said to have smiled and murmured, "The wolf is down." And among the English people, they did not mourn as they had for Henry V or Henry VII. Instead, they whispered stories. They repeated an old prophecy, "He who sows blood shall reap decay." They did not dare mock openly, but in taverns and marketplaces the tale spread faster than wildfire. Of the swollen corpse, the coffin that burst, the dogs in the abbey, Seymour's enforced silence only made people believe the legends more. Meanwhile, Henry's death opened doors for the living. Nobles recalculated their positions. Religious reformers placed their hopes in Edward VI, a child but one shaped by Protestant tutors. Catholics quietly waited their turn, looking to Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, who might one day restore their faith. Within days, the rot of one body became the spark for new ambitions. For common folk who knew nothing of secret councils, the story of a mysterious death was enough to fuel legends. Some swore they saw Henry's ghost wandering Hampton Court, leaning on his staff, tapping a skull on the stone floor. Others claimed that each night at St. Cannon's Abbey, where the coffin had burst, the king's growl could still be heard. Ghosts crept into the imagination, turning Henry into a figure of both history and horror. In silence, in fear, and in whispers, Henry VIII lived on. Not as a man, but as a shadow. When Henry VIII's lead coffin was lowered into the ground at Windsor, many thought the final chapter had closed. But in truth, it was only the beginning of a chain of ghostly legends, stories whispered in taverns, marketplaces, and abandoned monasteries. The people murmured, Henry would never rest. A king who executed 2 wives, destroyed countless churches, and spilled blood across the land. Could such a man truly sleep beneath the earth? For the common folk, the answer was no. Some said that on stormy nights at Hampton Court, the sound of a staff echoed on the stone floor, slow, hollow, relentless, like the heartbeat of death itself. The bravest servants swore they saw a massive, limping figure moving down the corridor, a skull-topped cane in hand, pale blue eyes glowing in the dark. They believed it was Henry, still searching for traitors among the living. At St. Cannon's Abbey, where his coffin once burst, the legends grew darker. Villagers whispered that on winter nights the abandoned church reeked of death, though no one was inside. Some claimed they saw packs of stray dogs gather there, howling as if haunted by the memory of the rotting corpse they had licked. One old woman swore, "I saw a giant shadow seated in the chapel, blood dripping from his hands, growling, 'I am king, I am still king.'" In Windsor, where Henry was buried, pilgrims sometimes claimed they heard heavy breathing rising from beneath the earth. Others trembled as they told of the ground swelling and sinking, as if a massive body still struggled to escape below. The priests there kept silent, but their silence only strengthened the rumors. Some legends even claimed Henry's ghost did not just haunt palaces, but returned to torment his successors. Under Edward VI, courtiers whispered of dreams in which Henry sat on the throne, his swollen face grinning, whispering, "The throne is mine. It will always be mine." Under Mary I, she herself confessed to a nightmare, Henry standing in a sea of blood, pointing at her and declaring, "You are my blood. Finish what I could not." The legend of Henry VIII seeped into collective memory as a symbol of fear. For many English men and women of the 16th and 17th centuries, he was not merely a king who had died. He was a violent spirit, still demanding power long after his flesh had rotted away. Even today, visitors to Hampton Court are told of Henry's phantom footsteps. Some swear they hear the tapping of a staff, the sound of labored breathing, or catch a glimpse of a hulking shadow at the end of the hall. Whether true or not, no one can say, but one thing is certain. In the imagination of the English people, Henry VIII never truly disappeared. The ghost of Henry, that is, the haunted legacy his shameful death left behind. A reminder that power may rule the living, but in death, what remains is only rot and restless shadows. It wasn't only historians, courtiers, or foreign ambassadors who kept the image of Henry VIII alive. In the villages of 16th century England, his story spread in its own way, through rhymes, gossip, and fireside tales. Most common folk had never seen the king in person, but they knew him through rumors and the royal decrees that shaped their daily lives. And so, Henry gradually became a figure half real, half legend. In some rural regions, children sang mocking rhymes. 6 wives, 2 heads gone. The fat king never stays too long. It was the simplest way to remember the tragedies of his marriages, but also a biting satire, words no one dared to speak aloud in public. In taverns, people whispered stories of King Henry devouring an entire feast and still demanding more pies. Likely an exaggeration, but it reflected the image held in popular memory, a king gluttonous, lustful, heavy, the opposite of the golden prince once celebrated at court. Some folk ballads even described his death with cruel irony. The coffin burst, dogs in the abbey. The king is gone, only the stench remains. Crude as they were, these verses kept alive the collective memory of Henry's humiliating end, despite the crown's attempts to bury the truth. Among displaced monks from dissolved monasteries, a darker tale circulated, that Henry was punished in the afterlife. Each night his ghost was condemned to limp through ruined cloisters, hearing broken prayers, hearing the cries of those he had sent to the scaffold. For them, his rotting death was no accident. It was God's justice. In other stories, Henry became a monster. Children were warned that if they misbehaved, the fat king with the pus-filled legs would come knocking at their door. A threat meant to replace the rod, but one that turned Henry into a horror figure in the imagination of the next generation. The further time moved on, the richer the legends became. By the 17th century, when his daughter Elizabeth I had risen as the Virgin Queen, a golden icon of England, the people looked back at Henry with mixed feelings. They resented him, yet admitted that without him there would have been no Elizabeth to take pride in. And so, folk songs about Henry mocked him and cursed him, yet also acknowledged him as a figure of destiny. In the memory of the people, Henry VIII was never just a historical king. He became a story character, half real, half imagined, at once a warning and a jest. People sang of him, laughed at him, feared him, but never forgot him. And it was this layer of folk memory that kept Henry alive, not in the splendor of palaces, but in the casual songs of commoners, in the trembling bedtime tales told to children by the fire, and in the half-serious, half-mocking stories whispered over mugs of ale. When news of Henry VIII's death began to slip beyond England's borders, Europe erupted. Though the English Privy Council tried to bury the truth, diplomatic letters, secret reports, and popular rumors spread faster than fire, and each nation, each court, painted its own portrait of the fallen giant of England. In Paris, envoys wrote of Henry as nothing more than rotting flesh. The king, who once terrified the continent, was now described as a bloated mass of fat, immobile, fearful of his own shadow. The French mocked that he needed 6 men just to lift him from bed, and without them he was nothing but a prisoner trapped in his own body. Yet behind the mockery lingered caution. They knew, even as Henry lay dying, his authority still cast a shadow over England. A beast cornered could be more dangerous than ever, and no one forgot it. In Spain, The picture was harsher still. To them, Henry was not only tyrant but traitor. He had humiliated Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who was his first wife, and broken with the Pope to pursue Anne Boleyn. So when word came that Henry died with his body bursting, his coffin splitting open, Spanish envoys wrote of it as proof of God's justice. They compared him to Nebuchadnezzar, the biblical king punished by God, reduced to a beast for his pride. For Spain, Henry's rotten death was not a biological accident. It was divine retribution. In Rome, the Vatican received the news with a silence heavy with meaning. Publicly, no words of celebration, but in the halls of the church, men whispered, "The wolf has fallen." Henry had snapped the 1,000-year tie between England and Rome, seized monasteries, cast out monks into the streets. To Rome, he was not just a rebel, he was a blasphemer. So when he died in disgrace, the Pope and cardinals saw it as the final mark of holy justice, a soul already rotten, a body only following after. But Europe did not preserve Henry's end in dry reports alone. Stories and satire spread, songs and jokes leaping from Paris taverns to Madrid markets. In France, men raised their cups to the death of the English monster. In Spain, folk verses jeered, "The man who cast aside our queen died in stench with no one to wash him." And in Rome, monks whispered prayers, not for his soul but in thanks that he was gone. Still, not all was hatred and ridicule. Some observers admitted Henry VIII, despite his miserable end, had shaken Europe. By breaking with Rome, he carved out an independent English church, turning a small island kingdom into a force Europe could not ignore. His reforms, born of personal ambition and the hunger for a male heir, nonetheless forced the continent to reckon with him as a pioneer. And so, in Europe's memory, Henry became both monster and maker of history. That contradiction made him an endless subject. In France, playwrights called him the rotting king. In Spain, poets likened him to a chained beast. In Rome, he stood as proof that arrogance would be punished, yet others still called him the man who dared to defy Rome and lived. His image spread across the continent, no longer just a man, but a mirror for both fear and admiration. And so when you look at 16th century Europe, you find Henry VIII everywhere, in cold dispatches, in mocking songs, in whispered prayers, in nervous courts, yet remembered, a man who died in stench, yet left a mark on the whole continent that time could not erase. Though Henry VIII died in disgrace, his body rotting, his legend haunted, the physical traces of him still remain, like fragments of a life both dazzling and grotesque. If you walk through London today and step into the Tower of London, you'll find Henry's massive suits of armor. The earliest one shows a lean, athletic figure, a tight waist, broad shoulders like a warrior. But as the years went on, the armor swelled larger and larger until the final set measured a waist of 54 inches, almost as wide as a modern refrigerator. It isn't just finely forged steel, it is a confession in iron showing how Henry's body transformed from golden prince to diseased giant. Standing before that armor, you feel the passage of time, as if each rivet still carries the sound of the king's labored breath. Leave the tower and head to Hampton Court, the lavish palace Henry made the center of his power. There, long corridors and cavernous dining halls still speak of feasts that once outshone all of Europe. But look closer at the steps and doors, and you'll see reinforcements and widened frames. Stories tell that by the end of his life, Henry had grown so massive that doors had to be widened, floors shored up, lest the palace collapse under his weight. Those repairs remain like architectural scars, reminders of a king who became a burden even within his own palace. And then, the portraits. Hans Holbein, the genius painter of the Tudor court, gave the world its most famous image of Henry. Legs spread wide, stance defiant, eyes burning with pride. Yet modern X-rays of the final portrait revealed something chilling. Henry's hand once gripped a staff topped with a skull, later painted over to hide it. That detail exposed the morbid obsession with death that shadowed his final years. Art meant to glorify power had, instead, preserved its darkness. Even his clothes, his chairs, his daily objects betray the truth. Chairs built oversized with removable arms to fit his swollen body. Beds reinforced with thick timber because his frame would snap ordinary ones. These objects now sit in museums, but if you look long enough, you can almost hear the heavy breathing, the groans, and smell the stench that once filled the rooms they occupied. And there is another trace less visible, but far deeper, the ruined walls of monasteries across England. Henry ordered them dissolved, their lands seized, their monks cast out. Today, when you walk past crumbling stone, broken arches, or shattered cloisters, you walk through Henry's legacy. Every fractured wall is a reminder of a reign that placed ambition and power above faith. These relics, armor, portraits, chairs, monasteries, are not just museum pieces. They are silent witnesses to the violent contrasts of Henry's life, from splendor to rot, from golden prince to shameful corpse. And when visitors today stand before them, whether in galleries or in ruins, they still whisper about the man, not just as a king, but as a symbol of the tragedy of power. When the earth closed over Henry VIII's lead coffin at Windsor, people thought the story had ended. But in truth, his death was only the beginning of another journey, the journey of memory. And that memory, for centuries, has never been silent. In official history, Henry is carved into posterity through grand portraits, standing firm, eyes of command, a blazing red beard, and a waistline that seemed to swallow the frame itself. This was the image the Tudor court worked hard to preserve, to remind future generations that even in disgrace, he was still a powerful king. Yet, over time, other fragments began to surface. From courtiers' diaries, from the reports of foreign ambassadors, from whispers that spread through taverns, that portrait cracked. Instead of an invincible monarch, Henry emerged as a mortal man, diseased, paranoid, obsessed with death, and finally consumed by decay he could not hide. In England, common folk kept the memory alive in simple, sharp verses. 6 wives, 2 heads fell. The fat king never sat well. In those rhymes, Henry was no longer a mighty ruler but a joke, a warning. In France, they called him the rotting king. In Spain, his death was seen as divine punishment. In Rome, he was remembered as the fallen wolf. Different words, but all carried the same meaning. Henry VIII was not remembered as a wise ruler, but as a man of contradictions, fearsome and pitiful all at once. And yet, no one could erase his mark. By breaking with the Pope, Henry paved the way for the birth of the Church of England. He turned a small island kingdom on Europe's edge into a religiously independent force, unwittingly shaping the very identity of England. That legacy was so vast that, whether mocked or cursed, it could not be denied. The cruelest irony was that Henry's greatest dream, a male heir, proved the least enduring part of his legacy. Edward VI died young, Mary I ruled in blood and fire, and Elizabeth I, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the very wife Henry sent to the scaffold, was the one who truly led England into a golden age. What Henry craved most, a prince to succeed him, mattered less than the daughter he once dismissed. In modern culture, Henry remains everywhere. He appears in novels, in films, on stage, even in television shows. People sum him up in a single haunting line: divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. 6 wives, 6 fates, 6 verdicts etched into collective memory. Yet if you look closer, what makes Henry so haunting is not just the drama of love and betrayal, but the violent contrast of his life itself, from golden prince to rotting king, dying in humiliation that no power could erase. Today, when you walk through Hampton Court, down its cold corridors, or gaze at his massive armor in the Tower of London, you still feel Henry's presence. Not the presence of a great monarch, but of a man betrayed by his own ambition and his own body. A figure both real and legendary, both pride and nightmare. May 25th, Henry VIII leaves us with a lesson that never grows old. Absolute power does not guarantee immortality. It can lift a man above all others, but it can also cast him down faster than anyone else. And Henry, whose corpse burst and was licked by dogs, remains the most vivid proof of that brutal truth. So when history speaks his name, we remember not only a king, but a tragedy. A man who once shone like gold, only to fall and rot, leaving a stench that haunted all of Europe. A story that is both history and warning. And perhaps that is why, more than 400 years later, the name Henry VIII still sends a shiver down the spine. And so, you and I have traveled together through a long journey. From the radiant dawn of England's golden prince, to the terrible twilight filled with the stench of death, and finally, to the legacy and haunting memory he left behind. Henry VIII, a man who once touched the very peak of power, yet in the end died with his body bursting, licked by dogs, and became a ghost in Europe's memory. Perhaps what makes this story unforgettable is not only the horror of his death, but the paradox. A king who once made an entire continent tremble, yet could not control his own failing body. And it is that fragility, that contrast, that makes Henry VIII one of the most tragic and haunting chapters of history. If you feel a chill running through you, that's only natural. History is sometimes like a mirror, reflecting not only those who came before, but also something within ourselves. Henry VIII reminds us that power, beauty, wealth, and glory, all of it can fade. What remains is only the story told by others, and the way we are remembered. And now, as the story comes to a close, you can let your mind release its grip. Allow the distant echoes of the past to fade away, leaving only a gentle stillness in the room where you are. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let sleep carry you away. Wishing you a peaceful night. Sleep well.